Okay, so in this video we're gonna go through the exercise file on how you do render layer inside Maya. So if you open up the file, you'll get something like this. Okay, so it's a very simple scene, right? We only have one character and the background and two lights. Okay, and if you render, you'll get something like this. Now, do you notice that I'm using the Redshift demo? So I'm using the latest Redshift 2.6 from the official website, and it might have slightly different attributes. So I think the directional light now will have like intensity and exposure, as previously don't have. Okay, so the idea of the scene is try to mimic what we had in the slide previously. So we have the character on the location and then leaving the location. Now, what you do notice in this shot and in this shot as well is that the setup is the same. So I already made up the pre-made bookmark. So if you look at the character, there is an animation from frame 1 to frame 20, and this is what it does. Okay, very simple animation. It's just like character on the focus, then as it goes to frame 20, the character leaving the location. Okay, so it's pretty much the same. Now, so again, the idea is that we're going to render the background one time, and then we're going to render the character as accordingly, right? Which is like 20 frames. Okay, because there is no reason for you to render the background again and again. Okay, so if you do not use the render layer system, then Maya will render the whole thing as one frame. Then as it goes to frame number 2, it will render the whole background and the character again. And in frame 3, we'll do the same thing again. Frame 4, we'll do the same thing again, and it wastes quite a bit of time. That's why we're going to separate these using render layer. Now, when you want to use render layer, right, there are two different types. Okay, so you have the new type, which is right here. Okay, this is the new render layer setup, but I don't use this method. Okay, so I prefer to use the old legacy render layer. Okay, so I mean, it's okay to use this one. Feel free, and I encourage you to try using the new render layer system. Okay, but in this case, I'm still comfortable using the old one, so I need to load the old legacy because you have to choose one or the other. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the rendering, and from here I'm going to legacy. Now, when you choose this to legacy, you need to restart your Maya. Okay, so I'm gonna save. I'm gonna click the file. Okay, and I need to restart my Maya. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the video right while I'm restarting my Maya. Okay, so I've restarted my Maya, and as you can see, I have the extra tab here. It's called render, and this is the old legacy render layer. Now, by default, everything will have or will be placed in this master layer, and if you render, right, this is what you get. Okay, so you cannot delete the master layer. Now, what we need to do now is that we're going to render the background. So I'm going to select everything. Okay, so I'm going to open up the outline as well. Put here. Now, I'm going to click this button. So what it means, like, it will create new layer and put everything what you selected there. Okay, I'm going to call this BG. Now, BG right now is identical to what is in the master layer. Okay, they're both exactly the same. Now, if I render BG, right, this is what I have. Now, the thing is that we don't want the character to be appear in BG, right? Because BG stands for background. We just want the background only. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, because if I hide the character, right, when I go back to master layer, the character also missing. Okay, so that is incorrect. Okay, so what we want is the character is hidden in BG, and when you go to muscle layer, the character are still shown. But right now, we cannot do that. Okay, so that's when this thing comes into play, the render stat and the layer override. Okay, now I want to press Ctrl A, so, and then you go to this second tab, so you can see this one, and you go to the render stat. Okay, so every object that you see in the scene basically will have its own render stat. Okay, so this one for the plane or for the curtain, this one for the ground. Okay, will have each own individual render stat. Now, so what is a render stat? So a render stat is basically just a collection of settings that tell the render engine to whether it can cast shadow, can receive shadow, can be visible or not visible. Okay, so this is basically just a collection of setting. Okay, now what about this layer override? Okay, so before we do that, okay, let's just do this render, but this time I'm going to hide. I'm going to hide. Okay, and when you click, it does the same thing, right? The character is still there, but it's just not being rendered. Okay, so this is pretty advanced feature. So let's say I have this giant cube here, right? And I want to, and if I render, right, turn this back on as a default setting. Okay, and I get something like this. Okay, now the good thing about this, like, you can actually tweak any setting that you want. So for example, if you want the lady not to cast any shadow, you can actually untick that one, and when you render, right, this will not render its shadow. Okay, so you can see the difference. So this is a very powerful feature, and you might need it when it comes to rendering a complex scene, right? You can also like make sure it doesn't receive shadow, and also it's not visible in reflection or refraction. Okay, so this is something that is called render stat. Now, what about the layer override? Well, so now we have two layers, right? We want the lady to be hidden in the background, but when it comes to muscle layer, it's not hidden. Okay, so this is when the layer override comes into play. So while the background is selected, I'm going to press Ctrl A, and I'm going to right click and override. Okay, now the color of this setting become orange. That means like there is an override function or command is being written here. Okay, and I'm going to untick. Okay, so when I render in the background layer, this is what I have, and when I'm switching to the muscle layer, this is what I have. Okay, so it's a very powerful feature. So it will set a command on the individual layer that you have there. Okay, so whatever setting that you have previously in the muscle layer or whatever layer, when you right click and override, Maya will overwritten that setting. Okay, and that's how powerful the feature. So if you want to have a particular setting for that particular layer, you can use that right click and layer override. Okay, because it will override whatever you had previously. Okay, and now if you look at it, this is the correct setting that we want, right? We want the lady to be hidden here, and we go to the muscle layer, the lady is shown. Okay, so that's how layer override works. Okay, and you can also pretty much right click almost every attributes here. So whenever you right click and then you can see this command, then you can use that layer override. Okay, so if you want, for example, like do not cast shadow, you can also right click and then like turn off. So in this case, in this layer, this lady will not cast shadow. Okay, and if you want to remove, you right click, then remove, and it go back to the way it was. Okay, now I'm gonna go back to the camera view, and I'm gonna render. Okay, so everything looks good. So in this case, the lady is hidden because it's unticked for that BG layer. Okay, again, I'm going to create new layer, but this time I'm going to select the lady only and the light. Okay, and I'm gonna call this character. Okay, so this is a very basic setup on how you use a render layer. Okay, and if you do another test, okay, so don't mind about the watermark. I'm using a demo version, and I'll get something like this. Okay, and again, because this is an animation, right? Don't forget to use this one. Okay, animation maybe from frame 1 to frame 20, and I'm gonna render this using TIFF. And this is my file name, but I think it's too long, so I'm going to right click and then just use the render layer name. Okay, now it's just char.1.tiff. Maybe I'm going to put underscore. Does it work? Yes, underscore. And yeah, and I'm going to turn off my default light. So in this exercise, I'm just going to use a very low res of everything. The setting, everything is low res. Sample all is low res. Okay, so once you're ready, you can then go ahead and do a batch render. Okay, from here, a batch render. Now, when you want to do a batch render, okay, make sure you look at these settings. So when you click this, right, that means it's turned on. Right, that means this layer, char and BG, will be rendered in batch render. Okay, but that's not something that we want, right? Because you only want the BG to be rendered once. Okay, there is no need for you to batch render the BG. Otherwise, you will defeat the purpose of having rendering the BG one time. So let's turn off. So when you have this icon, that means it will not be rendered as batch render. You only render the character because it's turned on. Okay, so I think everything is in place, and now we're going to render, and I'm going to stop the video while it's rendering. Okay, so I finished with my rendering, and if you notice that the 3 last frame is black, that's because the character left the scene already and everything is just empty or dark scene. Okay, you don't have to worry about this. Now, as you can see, I also render my background. So I go to my background layer and I do single frame render. And if you look at the character render, okay, so this is all the animation for that character. Okay, so I'm just going to use Photoshop to composite it, but again, I encourage you to use After Effects so you can load this animation, and the result should be something like this. Okay, so when you play, or when you load in After Effects, you can see the animation. Okay, but for this demonstration, I'm just going to use Photoshop, which is much quicker. So again, I load my background and I load my character. If it's After Effects, this is going to be your character animation. Okay, and if I go duplicate to my background, I'll get something like this. Okay, and now I have the ability to kind of like change. Okay, so I'm going to use Control L to change the light of the character if I needed to. Okay, so that's a very powerful feature by just using a render layer. Okay, so you can see like when I change the color or intensity, it doesn't affect the background. Okay, so this is a very basic tutorial on how you use a render layer.